My twin brother Daniel found what he thought was an $8 million winning lottery ticket last week, and within 4 hours had live streamed himself, throwing all my belongings off our apartment balcony while screaming about finally dumping his loser twin brother. I'm writing this from a motel room trying to process what just happened because, honestly, I never expected him to go this far. Daniel and I are 23 and we've shared this two-bedroom apartment for almost 3 years since our parents retired to Florida. The arrangement worked because Daniel makes solid money at his warehouse supervisor job, while I'm stuck making minimum wage stocking shelves at a big box store. He never let me forget this fact either, see-wise. Every month when rent was due, he'd make some comment about how he was basically carrying me financially, even though I always paid my exact half of everything on time. The thing is, Daniel has always resented me for what he calls my lack of ambition. When we were kids, he was the one who got good grades and played sports, while I struggled with school and spent most of my time playing video games or reading. Our parents never really compared us directly, but Daniel definitely picked up on the fact that they worried about my future more than his. After high school, he immediately got this warehouse job through a friend and worked his way up to supervisor within 2 years. Meanwhile, I bounced between different retail jobs, never making more than minimum wage. Daniel started treating me like a charity case he was stuck supporting. He'd make jokes to his friends about his deadbeat twin brother who couldn't get his life together. When his girlfriend Sarah came over, she'd make little comments about how nice it must be for me to have such a responsible brother looking out for me. The worst part was Daniel would just smile and nod along like I wasn't sitting right there. Last Tuesday, we went to the gas station like we do every week to grab lunch, and I bought 2 scratch tickets with my lunch money like I always do. I scratched them in the car while Daniel went inside to get his energy drink and Red Bull. The second ticket looked like a winner, $8 million. But I couldn't believe it was real. When Daniel got back to the car, I handed him the ticket and told him to double-check the numbers because I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The second Daniel looked at that ticket, his entire face changed. He started shaking and yelling, "Oh my God! Oh my God!" and hitting the steering wheel. He called me an idiot for not realizing what I was holding and immediately started making plans about quitting his job and buying a new car. The drive home was pure chaos with him calling everyone in his phone contacts to tell them about his big win. By the time we got back to the apartment, Daniel had already posted on Facebook about his lottery win and was researching the claim process. He spent the rest of the afternoon calculating his after-tax winnings and making lists of everything he wanted to buy. I mostly sat there watching him plan his new life while he occasionally asked if I thought he should get a BMW or a Mercedes first. That evening, Sarah came over with champagne, and they started talking about moving to a bigger place together somewhere across town. Sarah was practically glowing, talking about how Daniel could finally upgrade his lifestyle and get away from situations that had been holding him back. She kept looking at me when she said, "holding him back," and it was pretty obvious what she meant. Around 9 p.m., Daniel told me we needed to have a serious conversation about the living situation. He said now that he had money, he wanted to make some changes, and that meant I needed to find somewhere else to live within the week. When I asked about our lease, Daniel laughed and said he could afford to break it and pay whatever penalties came with it. Sarah added that it was time for Daniel to surround himself with people who were on his level now. I asked where exactly he expected me to go with a week's notice, and Daniel shrugged and said that wasn't his problem anymore. He had carried me long enough, and now it was time for me to figure out how to be an adult on my own. Sarah nodded along and said maybe this would be the motivation I needed to finally get serious about my life. The next morning, I woke up to Daniel on the phone, with the lottery office scheduling his appointment to claim the prize. He had already called in sick to work for the rest of the week and was planning to drive to the state capitol on Friday. While he was talking, I could hear him giving them my name and credit card information to verify the purchase details. When I got home from my shift that afternoon, Daniel had packed all my stuff into garbage bags and stacked them by the front door. There was a note saying I had until 6 p.m. to get everything out because his friends were coming over to celebrate and he didn't want me there for it. I started loading what I could fit into my beat-up Honda, but realized I couldn't take everything in one trip. At exactly 6 p.m., Daniel showed up with Sarah and 3 of his buddies from work. One of them had brought his phone to livestream what happened next. Daniel announced to whoever was watching that they were about to see what happens to people who try to drag successful people down their whole lives. Then he grabbed the remaining garbage bags and started hurling them over our third-floor balcony railing. His audience was eating it up, while Daniel provided commentary about finally being free from supporting deadbeats who never contributed anything. My work clothes and personal stuff scattered across the parking lot while his friends cheered and Sarah recorded everything on her phone. Daniel made sure to tell his viewers this was what real success looked like. Having enough money to cut toxic people out of your life instantly. The whole performance lasted about 20 minutes and ended with Daniel telling everyone watching that blood doesn't mean you have to tolerate losers who hold you back. After the stream ended, they all went inside, and I could hear them planning a bigger celebration party for the weekend. I spent that night at the cheapest motel I could find, trying to figure out my next move. Daniel texted me around midnight saying he was changing the locks the next day, and I shouldn't bother trying to come back for anything I might have forgotten. He also mentioned that he'd be happy to give my new address to anyone who asked, so they could see how the other half lives now. Thursday morning, I drove back to get my laptop for job applications and found Daniel had already sold it to one of his coworkers for 50 bucks. When I knocked on what used to be my door, Daniel answered with the biggest smirk on his face and told me to consider it back rent for all the times he had covered for me over the years. I reminded him that I had always paid my exact half of everything, and he just laughed and said broke people always had excuses. Before I left, I found my car in the parking lot with "Loser" spray-painted across both sides in bright red letters. Daniel had taken photos and posted them in our family WhatsApp group with a message explaining that he wanted to help me advertise my true nature to potential employers. Our parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins all saw those photos, but nobody responded to them. That afternoon, Daniel was posting constant updates about his Friday appointment to claim his winnings. He had calculated exactly how much he'd take home after taxes and was already shopping for luxury cars online. Sarah quit her job and posted about maybe going back to school now that money wouldn't be an issue for them anymore. The final message Daniel sent me that night said he didn't have a brother anymore, just a genetic mistake he was erasing from his life. He said I was blocked from all his social media and his phone number would be changing after he collected his prize money. The message ended with him telling me not to try contacting him again because he was done supporting failures who would never amount to anything. I texted back that I was happy for his success and hoped everything worked out well for him. Daniel responded by calling me pathetic and saying even my fake congratulations proved how desperate I was for attention from someone who had actually made something of his life. Then he stopped responding entirely. Friday came and Daniel drove to the state capitol with Sarah to claim what he thought was his prize. Based on his social media posts, they made a whole day of it with dinner at an expensive restaurant in a hotel room downtown. Daniel posted photos of himself outside the lottery office building and said he'd update everyone once the paperwork was finished. But here's the thing, nobody knows yet. And I'm honestly still trying to decide how I feel about what's about to happen. Update 1. So Friday rolls around and Daniel drives to the state capitol with Sarah to claim what he thinks is his $8 million prize. I'm sitting in this crappy motel room watching his Instagram stories of them at some fancy steakhouse celebrating while I'm eating gas station sandwiches. But honestly, I'm not even mad anymore. See, there's something Daniel doesn't know yet, and I'm starting to think this whole situation might work out better than I ever imagined. The thing is, when I bought those scratch tickets last Tuesday, I used my debit card like I always do. My name is on the receipt, my card was charged, and the lottery office has all that information in their system. Daniel can march into that building with the physical ticket all he wants. But when they run the verification process, they're going to see that the purchase was made by me, not him. But here's where it gets interesting. I haven't told him this yet. In fact, I've been letting him dig himself deeper and deeper into this fantasy while I sit back and watch. Every social media post, every celebration, every person he's told about his big win is just making what's coming next so much more satisfying. Daniel texted me Saturday morning from his hotel room saying the lottery office was closed weekends, but he'd be first in line Monday morning to collect his prize. He also mentioned that he'd already put down a deposit on a new BMW and was looking at condos across town. Sarah had apparently spent the entire Friday night shopping online for furniture and clothes, using Daniel's credit card because she was so confident the money was coming. The messages kept coming throughout Saturday. Daniel wanted to make sure I understood that this lottery win proved he was always meant for bigger things than being stuck supporting a deadbeat twin brother. He said maybe now I'd finally understand why he always resented having to share DNA with someone who had no ambition or drive to succeed. That last message actually made me laugh, because Daniel has always been jealous of the fact that our parents worried more about my future than his. When we were kids, he used to get furious when Mom would spend extra time helping me with homework, or when Dad would ask me about my plans after graduation. Daniel needed everyone to see him as the successful twin who had everything figured out, and my struggles made him look better by comparison. Sunday evening, Daniel posted a long Facebook rant about how lottery wins separate the people who deserve success from those who don't. He said some people are born leaders who make things happen, while others are followers who expect handouts their entire lives. The post got dozens of likes and comments from friends and family congratulating him and agreeing that he deserved this windfall. Sarah shared the post and added her own commentary about how excited she was to start their new life together without any dead weight holding them back. She specifically mentioned how refreshing it was going to be for Daniel to surround himself with people who matched his energy and ambition instead of having to constantly deal with negative influences. Monday morning finally arrives, and Daniel is posting Instagram stories from outside the lottery office building. He's practically bouncing with excitement, talking about how this is the day that changes everything. Sarah is right there with him, recording everything for posterity and talking about how proud she is of her successful boyfriend who's about to collect his prize. Then around noon, the posts suddenly stop. No updates, no celebration photos, nothing. I'm starting to wonder if maybe something went wrong with their appointment when my phone starts buzzing with calls from Daniel. The first few I let go to voicemail because honestly, I want to see how desperate he gets before I answer. The voicemails are frantic. Daniel is stumbling over his words, trying to explain that there's been some kind of mistake at the lottery office. They're saying the ticket was purchased with my card and my name is on all the paperwork. He wants me to call him back immediately because we need to fix this error before someone else tries to claim his winnings. By the fourth voicemail, Daniel is practically screaming into the phone. He's convinced this is some kind of computer glitch, and he needs me to come down to the lottery office right away to verify that I gave him permission to claim the ticket. He keeps saying they just need to see us together to confirm that we both agreed he was the rightful winner. I finally answer the phone on his 8th attempt. Daniel launches into this long explanation about how there's obviously been some administrative mix-up and we need to sort it out before his prize money gets tied up in bureaucratic nonsense. I let him talk for about 5 minutes before I casually mention that, actually, there's no mistake at all. The silence on the other end of the line is incredible. Daniel finally asks what exactly I mean by that, and I explain that when I bought those tickets, I used my debit card, which means technically I'm the legal purchaser regardless of who physically holds the ticket. I can practically hear his brain trying to process this information while Sarah is asking him in the background what's happening. Daniel starts arguing that I handed him the ticket voluntarily, which means I transferred ownership to him. I point out that nowhere in our conversation did I actually give him the ticket. I just asked him to double-check the numbers because I thought I was seeing things wrong. He was the one who assumed he could keep it and started making plans. The conversation goes on for almost an hour, with Daniel getting more and more agitated. He keeps insisting that everyone already knows he won the lottery, and there's no way he can go back and tell people it was actually mine. He's already quit his job, put deposits on purchases, and made promises to Sarah about their future together. According to Daniel, I need to transfer the winnings to him because he's already committed to this new life. I asked Daniel if he remembers throwing my belongings off the balcony while live streaming it to humiliate me. I bring up the spray paint on my car and the messages to our family group chat. I mention how he sold my laptop and told me I was a genetic mistake he was erasing from his life. Daniel gets quiet for a minute before saying that was all just heat-of-the-moment stuff, and now we need to focus on solving this lottery situation. That's when I tell Daniel that I'll be happy to discuss transferring the winnings to him. But first, we need to have a longer conversation about how he's treated me over the years. I suggest we meet up in person so we can really work through everything properly. Daniel immediately agrees and asks when and where I want to meet. The thing is, I've been thinking about this moment for years. Not specifically the lottery situation, obviously, but the moment when Daniel would finally need something from me instead of the other way around. I've been watching him treat me like garbage while building up his reputation as the successful twin, and now I finally have leverage. But I'm not rushing into anything. I tell Daniel I need a few days to think about everything, and I'll get back to him by Thursday. The desperation in his voice, when he asks why I need so much time, is absolutely beautiful. For the first time in our adult lives, Daniel needs me more than I need him. And honestly, I'm planning to make the most of it. Update 2. Those 3 days between Monday and Thursday were absolutely incredible to watch. Daniel went from posting confident updates about minor paperwork delays to completely radio silence by Wednesday. His Instagram stories went from luxury car shopping to nothing. Sarah stopped posting altogether after Tuesday when reality started setting in. Daniel called me 17 times on Tuesday alone. The voicemails started out trying to sound casual, but by evening he was barely holding it together. He kept saying we needed to meet immediately because the longer this dragged out, the more complicated everything would become. The desperation was just pouring through the phone, and honestly, I was enjoying every second of it. Wednesday morning, Daniel showed up at the big box store where I work. I was stocking shelves in the electronics section when I saw him pacing around near the entrance looking absolutely frantic. When he spotted me, he practically ran over and started talking about how we needed to step outside right away to discuss our situation. My manager wasn't thrilled about me taking an unscheduled break, But Daniel looked unhinged enough that she probably thought it was some kind of family emergency. We walked out to the parking lot, and Daniel immediately launched into this whole speech about how he'd been thinking about everything, and he realized he may have been too harsh when he kicked me out. He said he was stressed about money and took it out on me unfairly, but now that we had this lottery win, we could put all that behind us and start fresh as brothers. The fake sincerity was nauseating, but I let him keep talking. Daniel explained that he'd already quit his warehouse job and burned bridges with his supervisor because he was so excited about the lottery money. He'd put down deposits on the BMW and the condo and told Sarah she could quit her job too. According to Daniel, if I didn't transfer the winnings to him, he'd be completely ruined financially and socially. Everyone already knew he won the lottery, and there was no way to walk that back now. I asked Daniel if he remembered live streaming himself throwing my belongings off our balcony while calling me a genetic mistake. He got quiet for a minute before saying that was just him being dramatic for the camera, and I should know he didn't really mean any of that stuff. When I brought up the spray paint on my car and the messages to our family chat, Daniel waved his hand and said we could get my car repainted, and everyone would forget about the family drama once we were both rich. The conversation went on for almost an hour, with Daniel getting more and more frantic as I refused to commit to transferring the money. He kept insisting that I never intended to keep the winnings anyway, since I'd handed him the ticket to check. I pointed out that asking someone to verify numbers isn't the same as giving them ownership, especially when my name and payment method are on the purchase receipt. Daniel tried a different approach and started talking about how this lottery win was obviously meant to benefit both of us since we were twins and did everything together. He said it would be selfish of me to keep all 8 million when we'd both been struggling financially and could both use the money to build better lives. When I asked why he hadn't mentioned sharing when he thought he was the winner, Daniel got flustered and said that was different because he assumed I'd be happy for his success. Thursday morning came and Daniel was waiting in the parking lot when I arrived for my shift. He looked like he hadn't slept and was clutching his phone like he expected some kind of miracle call. When I walked over to him, he immediately started apologizing for everything that happened the previous week. Daniel said he'd been under tremendous stress about our financial situation and lashed out inappropriately, but he hoped I could forgive him so we could move forward as a family. I told Daniel I'd been thinking about our conversation and I was willing to consider transferring the lottery winnings to him. But I had some conditions that needed to be met first. The relief on his face was immediate, and he said he'd agree to anything as long as we could get this resolved quickly. That's when I explained that since he'd humiliated me publicly, I needed him to make some public corrections before I'd feel comfortable helping him out. My first condition was that Daniel needed to post on social media explaining that he'd made a mistake and the lottery ticket actually belonged to me. He needed to apologize for the way he treated me and acknowledge that I was the rightful winner. Daniel's face went completely white, and he asked if there was any way we could handle this privately without involving social media. I reminded him that he chose to make our business public when he live-streamed throwing my stuff off the balcony. The second condition was that Daniel needed to return or pay for everything he'd damaged or sold. That meant replacing my laptop, getting my car repainted, and covering the cost of the motel room I'd been staying in since he kicked me out. Daniel started calculating numbers in his head, and I could see him realizing how much this was going to cost when he had no income and already owed money on deposits he'd put down. My third condition was the big one. Daniel needed to reinstate me as a tenant on our apartment lease and publicly apologize to our family for the messages and photos he'd shared in our group chat. He also needed to call his work and ask for his job back, explaining that the lottery situation had fallen through. Daniel looked physically ill as I laid out these requirements, but he kept nodding along because what choice did he have? I told Daniel he had until Sunday to complete all 3 conditions and provide me with proof that he'd followed through. Once I verified everything was done to my satisfaction, I'd be happy to discuss transferring the lottery winnings to him. Daniel agreed immediately and asked if I wanted to meet Sunday evening to finalize everything. I said that would work perfectly and suggested we meet at our apartment since presumably he'd have handled the lease situation by then. That afternoon, Daniel started posting on social media. First came a Facebook post explaining that there had been some confusion about the lottery ticket and it actually belonged to his brother. He apologized for the error and said he hoped everyone would be understanding about the mix-up. The post got dozens of comments from confused friends and family asking what happened to his big win. Sarah's response was the most interesting. She commented asking why Daniel was throwing away their future together over some technicality with paperwork. According to Sarah, Daniel needed to fight for what was rightfully his instead of just giving up because of bureaucratic nonsense. Other people started chiming in agreeing with Sarah and saying Daniel should get a lawyer to contest the lottery office's decision. By Thursday evening, Daniel was calling me in a panic about the social media responses. He said people were pressuring him to fight me for the winnings, and he didn't know how to explain that it wasn't actually a legal issue. I reminded Daniel that this was exactly why I needed him to make a public correction, instead of letting people think he was the legitimate winner. The longer the lie went on, the harder it would be to walk back. Friday brought more complications. Daniel had gone to the car dealership to cancel his BMW order and discovered that the deposit he'd paid was non-refundable. The condo complex was also keeping his deposit since he'd failed to provide proof of funds within the required time frame. Sarah was furious about losing the deposits and started posting passive-aggressive comments about people who make promises they can't keep. The apartment situation was even worse. Daniel had given 30 days notice on our lease, and the landlord had already started showing the unit to potential tenants. Getting back on the lease would require reapplying and paying new deposits, since Daniel had voluntarily terminated his tenancy. The landlord was also annoyed about the flip-flopping and made it clear that Daniel's rental history would reflect his unprofessional handling of the situation. Saturday, Daniel was completely unraveling. His former supervisor at the warehouse had refused to rehire him after Daniel had quit without proper notice and bad-mouthed the company to his coworkers. Sarah was threatening to break up with him if he didn't figure out a way to get their money back from the failed deposits. Our family group chat was full of confused relatives asking for clarification about the lottery situation. I spent Saturday evening in my motel room making final preparations for Sunday's meeting. Daniel had managed to fulfill most of my conditions, but I could tell he was hanging on by a thread financially and emotionally. The public humiliation of admitting his mistake, combined with the real financial losses from his premature celebrations, had completely broken down his confident facade. Sunday morning, Daniel texted asking if we could meet earlier in the day because he was anxious to get everything resolved. I agreed to meet at 3 p.m. at our apartment complex since he'd managed to get back on the lease by paying double deposits. When I arrived, Daniel was already there with a folder of paperwork proving he'd completed all my requirements. He'd printed out screenshots of his social media posts, receipts for my replacement laptop, and an estimate for repainting my car. Daniel had even written out a formal apology letter for our family, explaining the confusion about the lottery ticket. He looked exhausted but hopeful as he handed me the folder and asked if this satisfied my conditions. I looked through everything carefully while Daniel sat there fidgeting with his phone. Sarah wasn't with him, which I thought was interesting, and when I asked about it, Daniel said she was giving us space to handle family business. The truth was probably that Sarah was furious about the money situation and didn't want to be around when Daniel officially gave up their lottery dreams. After reviewing all the paperwork, I told Daniel that he'd done a good job meeting my requirements and I was impressed with his thoroughness. The relief on his face was incredible as he started talking about how glad he was that we could put this whole mess behind us and get back to being brothers. Daniel said he'd learned his lesson about treating family badly and promised things would be different going forward. That's when I looked Daniel right in the eye and told him there was just one more small detail we needed to discuss before I could transfer the winnings. I explained that during the past week I'd been doing some thinking about our relationship, and I'd realized that his behavior toward me wasn't just about the lottery situation. This was a pattern that went back years, and I needed to address it properly. Daniel's face went completely blank as I started explaining that I'd been planning for a moment like this for a very long time. Not specifically the lottery situation, but any opportunity where he would finally need something from me, instead of treating me like a burden he had to carry. I told Daniel that I'd been watching him build up his reputation as the successful twin while making me look like a failure, and now it was time for some corrections. The color drained from Daniel's face as he realized what I was actually saying. Final update. The look on Daniel's face when I told him this had been years in the making was absolutely priceless. He sat there for a full minute, trying to process what I just said before asking what exactly I meant by planning for a moment like this. That's when I explained that I'd been watching him treat me like garbage for our entire adult lives while building up his reputation as the successful twin, and I'd always known that eventually there would be a situation where he'd need something from me. Daniel started getting defensive and said he'd never treated me badly. He'd just been honest about our different levels of success and ambition. According to Daniel, everything he'd said about my lack of drive was true, and he'd actually been trying to motivate me to do better with my life. He insisted that good brothers tell each other hard truths instead of enabling failure, and if I was upset about his honesty, that was my problem to deal with. I asked Daniel if he remembered high school when our parents were worried about my grades and spent extra time helping me with homework. Daniel's face went dark, and he said that had nothing to do with our current situation. But I kept going and reminded him how he used to get furious when Mom and Dad would ask me about my plans for after graduation or when they'd suggest I might need help applying for community college programs. Daniel tried to interrupt, but I wasn't finished. I brought up how he'd always resented that our parents worried more about my future than his, because he was obviously the one who had everything figured out. The problem was that Daniel needed everyone to see him as the successful twin who was carrying his failure of a brother, and my struggles made him look better by comparison. Every time he called me a deadbeat or made jokes about supporting me, he was really just trying to convince himself and everyone else that he deserved more attention and recognition. The conversation went on for over 2 hours with Daniel getting more and more agitated as I laid out exactly how he'd been treating me. He kept insisting that he'd always been supportive and had tried to help me improve my situation, but I had receipts for everything. Every condescending comment about my minimum wage job. Every time he'd introduce me to his friends as his deadbeat twin brother. Every social media post where he'd made jokes about supporting family members who couldn't support themselves. Daniel finally asked what I wanted from him and whether completing all my conditions meant we could put this behind us and move forward. That's when I explained that actually, I had no intention of transferring the lottery winnings to him at all. The conditions weren't requirements for getting the money. They were just ways to make him humiliate himself publicly and suffer some financial consequences for how he'd treated me over the years. The silence in that apartment was incredible. Daniel just stared at me like he couldn't believe what he was hearing before asking if I was seriously going to keep $8 million, while my own brother lost everything he'd worked for. I reminded Daniel that he'd already told me he didn't have a brother anymore, just a genetic mistake he was erasing from his life. According to his own words, we weren't family, so why would I owe him anything? Daniel started panicking and said all that stuff about not having a brother was just him being dramatic, and I should know he didn't mean any of it. He brought up how we were twins and had shared everything our entire lives, so obviously we should share the lottery winnings too. When I pointed out that he hadn't mentioned sharing when he thought he was the winner, Daniel said that was different because he'd assumed I'd be happy to see him succeed and wouldn't need the money anyway. I told Daniel that I'd spent the past 3 years watching him treat me like a charity case while taking credit for being the responsible twin who supported his deadbeat brother. Every rent payment where he acted like he was doing me a favor, even though I always paid my exact half. Every time he made jokes to his friends about carrying me financially. Every comment about how I was holding him back from the life he deserved. Daniel had built his entire identity around being better than me, and now it was time for him to find out what being the failure actually felt like. Daniel tried arguing that losing the lottery money would completely destroy his life since he'd already quit his job and made financial commitments based on the winnings. I asked him how he thought I felt when he threw all my belongings off the balcony while live streaming it to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. Daniel said that was just one bad day when he was excited about the money and made poor decisions, but ruining his entire future over one mistake was completely disproportionate. The back and forth continued for another hour with Daniel trying every angle he could think of. He offered to split the winnings 50-50, then suggested I take $6 million and give him $2 million to cover his losses. When that didn't work, Daniel started talking about how I was destroying our family relationship over money, and our parents would be devastated when they found out what I'd done to him. I reminded Daniel that our parents had already seen the photos he'd posted of spray painting my car and the messages about me being a genetic mistake. That's when Daniel got really desperate and started trying to convince me that Sarah would leave him if he couldn't provide the lifestyle he'd promised her. According to Daniel, Sarah had already quit her job and made plans for their future based on the lottery money. So if I didn't help them out, I'd be ruining her life too. I asked Daniel why I should care about Sarah's situation when she'd been calling me dead weight and posting about how excited she was for Daniel to get away from negative influences. Daniel's phone started buzzing with calls from Sarah, and he ignored the first few before finally answering. I could hear Sarah asking whether he'd gotten the money situation figured out, and when they could start making plans again. Daniel tried to explain that there had been some complications and he needed more time to work things out, but Sarah wasn't having it. She wanted to know exactly what was happening and why Daniel couldn't just handle one simple paperwork issue with the lottery office. The conversation with Sarah went on for about 15 minutes with Daniel trying to avoid explaining the real situation while Sarah got more and more frustrated. Finally, Sarah demanded that Daniel put her on speaker so she could talk to me directly about resolving whatever misunderstanding was preventing them from getting their money. Daniel looked at me desperately, but I just shrugged and told him to put her on speaker. Sarah immediately started talking about how she understood there had been some confusion about the lottery ticket, but everyone needed to focus on finding a solution instead of getting caught up in technicalities. According to Sarah, families were supposed to support each other and help each other succeed, so obviously the right thing to do was make sure the money went to whoever could use it most effectively. She said Daniel had big plans and ambitions while I'd never shown any interest in improving my situation, so clearly Daniel should be the one managing the winnings. I let Sarah talk for about 5 minutes before asking her if she remembered posting about how excited she was for Daniel to get away from dead weight that had been holding him back. Sarah got quiet for a second before saying that was just her being protective of her boyfriend and wanting him to reach his full potential. When I brought up her comments about Daniel deserving better than sharing DNA with a failure, Sarah said I was taking her words out of context and she'd never meant anything personal against me. The three-way conversation continued for another hour, with Sarah and Daniel tag teaming to try to convince me that keeping the lottery money would be selfish and destructive to our family relationships. They kept talking about how I'd never cared about money before, so why was I suddenly being greedy when I had the chance to help the people I supposedly loved? Daniel brought up how he'd supported me for years by splitting the apartment costs, and how this was my chance to pay him back for all his help. I finally told them both that I'd made my decision, and there was nothing they could say to change my mind. The lottery ticket was purchased with my money, and my name was on all the paperwork, so legally and morally, the winnings belonged to me. Daniel and Sarah had spent the past week celebrating and planning their future based on money that was never theirs in the first place, and now they were dealing with the consequences of their assumptions. Sarah started crying and asking how I could destroy their lives over what she called a technicality about who physically bought the ticket. She said Daniel had worked so hard to build a successful life and finally had a chance to achieve his dreams, and I was taking that away from him out of spite. Daniel added that he'd learned his lesson about treating family badly and promised he'd be different going forward if I'd just give him this one chance to prove himself. I stood up and told them both that I was keeping every penny of the $8 million, and they needed to figure out how to deal with the consequences of their own choices. Daniel jumped up and said I couldn't just walk away from my own family like this, especially when I had the power to fix everything. Sarah was sobbing about how they'd already lost their deposits and Daniel's job, and now they had nothing left. That's when I explained the final part of my plan that they didn't know about yet. While Daniel had been running around town fulfilling my conditions and trying to undo the damage from his premature celebrations, I'd been working on something else. I'd contacted the landlord of our apartment building and explained that I was the lottery winner, not Daniel, and I'd be happy to take over the lease entirely since Daniel would probably be moving out soon anyway. Daniel's face went completely white as I explained that I'd also paid the landlord several months of rent in advance and asked him to start the eviction process against Daniel for violating the terms of his new lease agreement. Apparently, when Daniel had tried to get back on the lease after giving notice, he'd lied about his employment status and provided false information about his income. The landlord was not happy about being misled and was perfectly willing to terminate Daniel's tenancy immediately. Sarah asked what exactly I was saying, and I told her that Daniel had about 72 hours to find somewhere else to live before the sheriff's department would physically remove him from the premises. Since Daniel had no job, no savings, and no credit after defaulting on his car and condo deposits, his housing options were going to be pretty limited. Sarah started hyperventilating and asking where they were supposed to go with no money and no references for a rental application. I pulled out my phone and showed them both the screenshots I'd taken of Daniel's social media posts about me being a genetic mistake he was erasing from his life. I explained that I'd sent these screenshots to our parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, along with an explanation of how Daniel had treated me when he thought he was rich. Our entire extended family now knew exactly what kind of person Daniel really was when he thought he had power over other people. Daniel started begging me not to destroy his reputation with our family and said he'd do anything to make up for his mistakes. He offered to work for me for free, to publicly apologize for everything he'd done, to spend the next year proving he'd changed his attitude about our relationship. Sarah was crying about how this was ruining their entire future and asking why I had to be so cruel when I already had everything I wanted. I told them both that Daniel had spent years building his identity around being the successful twin who supported his deadbeat brother, and now he was going to find out what being the actual failure felt like. Every job application where potential employers could see his social media history, every rental application where landlords could check his references, every family gathering where everyone knew how he'd treated his own brother when he thought he had money. The conversation ended with Daniel and Sarah both crying and asking me to reconsider destroying their lives over what they kept calling a misunderstanding about the lottery ticket. But I'd been planning for this moment for 3 years, and I wasn't backing down now. Daniel wanted to know what it felt like to be successful and look down on family members who couldn't support themselves. So now he was going to experience both sides of that dynamic. I walked out of that apartment knowing that by Wednesday, Daniel and Sarah would be homeless, jobless, and completely cut off from the family support system Daniel had always taken for granted. The $8 million was just the beginning. Watching Daniel realize that his entire identity as the successful twin was built on nothing but luck and circumstances was going to be the real revenge. And honestly, after 3 years of being called a deadbeat genetic mistake, seeing Daniel and Sarah living in their car while I'm shopping for my new house feels like exactly the justice they deserve.